What is poetry? Who is a poet? What does the poet write about? And how does the poet do that? Imagine a poet speaking about this to us. That is exactly what we are going to look at today. This video is part of our series on literary criticism, and we will be looking at the most important points, concepts, and ideas, along with reading of the most important parts in the text in William Wordsworth's Let me talk a little bit about the context of this book, Lyrical Ballads, which is considered to be the starting point of the Romantic movement in England. The first edition of the Lyrical Ballads, which came out in 1798, did not have any kind of preface. When that book was published, there was a lot of confusion among the readers. So Wordsworth thought that he should write some introductory note regarding his object of writing these poems and his idea of poetry in general. So he wrote this preface, which came out with the second edition of the Lyrical Ballads in 1800. And then he revised this preface and then came as a revised form in the 1802 edition. So it can happen that when I'll be reading from the text, it might not match with the one that you are following. You don't have to worry because basically the concepts will be the same. It is just that the version might be different from the one that I'm reading from. Now, this preface is often critically considered to be the manifesto of Romanticism in England. But to understand what Wordsworth is trying to tell here, we have to understand that this is more of a reaction to what was happening before the publication of the Lyrical Ballad. Or we can classify that as the Neoclassical concept of poetry. So if we don't understand a little bit about the Neoclassical concept, we will not be able to understand how Wordsworth was going against it. Neoclassical perspective on poetry or art in general is more rooted in the classical traditions, as we see coming down from Horace, who writes Ars Poetica, and we have Aristotle writing Poetics for us. If we are to sum up this neoclassical concept of poetry in maybe just a few words, we can say that they were considering art as a mimetic process. Mimetic means imitation or representation. Representation of what? Representation of nature, representation of reality, whatever experiences you have in life. So you represent that through art. Therefore, art is intimately connected with the idea of technique. So poetry or poem is like you're crafting something. Okay, this was the usual classical idea. Wordsworth was essentially reacting against this. Now, there was one other thing that was going on during the time, and that brings us to the philosophical context of Wordsworth's emergence. We all know that the 18th century was a time of prose and reason, right? And the scientific thought was developing, the consciousness that we must doubt everything. We cannot take for granted things that are told to us. And that is what Descartes was talking about. And the Cartesian philosophy, that is something that is related to Descartes, is called Cartesian. The Cartesian philosophy says that I do not know anything that is given to me as statement. My work is to doubt things. The only thing I'm certain is that I am doubting, which means I am thinking. And because I'm thinking, it is proven that I exist. And this is the basis of the scientific way of thinking, as opposed to the idea that knowledge is built on faith. But the problem with Descartes is that it makes the individual, very alienated from the rest of the universe. It's like, I'm there, but I'm so uncertain of what is true that I feel alienated. And there is this constant conflict between mind and body, because body is a physical reality, mind is not a physical reality. So how can you connect the two? This problem is faced head-on by the Romantics. And that is exactly what Wordsworth tries to write in this preface. So when I'll come to that part in the text, I will come back to Descartes, okay? So don't worry. The only thing that I can tell now is that the way to bridge the gap between mind and body, or you can say the world of the spirits and the world of the physics, is through feelings. And therefore, in Wordsworth, we have anti-neoclassical tendencies, emphasizing spontaneity, originality, expression, as opposed to imitation. All right? Things will get clearer when we actually read his words, because he didn't say things in that complicated way as people generally feel if they look at his preface and try to understand each and every expression that he is using there. Our work is to focus on the most important questions that he is raising and attempting to answer. At the same time, it is a very good advice that I can give you is that whenever you feel confused about something that he is saying in this preface, you try to connect it to any of the poems that he has written, which you have read. And I think most of you already know about or have read Tintern Abbey, Immortality Ode, at least the Daffodils, okay, or the Solitary Reaper, upon Westminster Bridge, something I've read. And if you haven't, we have already done a couple of videos on Wordsworth's poems. You can go through them. You connect what he's trying to say here with what he's actually doing in his poetry. And it's not that always he is establishing a kind of coherence. It's not that whatever he says, he does in his poems, but still you understand what he says here when you read. And Tintern Abbey is like, I feel personally, it is a better manifesto of Romanticism than this preface is. So I don't know why he actually needed to write this, because Tintern Abbey says it all. All right. Now, let us first go to the text, read some parts, and then come back to our idea of how to look at this preface as a theory that he's trying to put forward. Now, the main points that we will come across, if you can list them down, it will go something like this. He first talks about the reception of his poems, how people are reacting to his poetry, about the way in which poetry is usually defined. Poets are usually defined. He would be talking about meter, poetic diction, and eventually he'll try to bring in his idea of imagination. And it is this idea of imagination, this idea of meter, that leads to his separation from the points of view that Coleridge held, and that led to quite a long-term distancing of these two friends. Okay, so let's just start from the beginning. The first part of the preface essentially deals with the way his poetry was expected to be received, and he thought that people wouldn't like it. Most people wouldn't like it, but he was surprised that, okay, many people appreciated his efforts. Now, these lyrical ballads, they were collection of poems by both Wordsworth and Coleridge, but Coleridge only wrote a handful of poems, 4 poems. The rest of the poems were all written by Wordsworth. So it was chiefly his lyrical ballads. He kind of monopolized it. It said that he supplied the poems of nature and Coleridge supplied the poems of supernature or supernatural things. In the first part itself, he acknowledges the help, the contribution of Coleridge, although he doesn't name him, but he names the poems. The first stanza goes like this. The first volume of these poems has already been submitted to general perusal. So he is talking about the 1798 version, which does not have the preface. Now he is saying that I'm writing a preface after I see how it is received by the people. It was published as an experiment. Now, this is the most important word, according to me, that he uses here, because experiment is a word from the field of science. Wordsworth uses this word to establish from the very beginning that he is very conscious about what he was trying to achieve here, that it was part of an experiment. And in an experiment, we are never sure about the outcome. And then he says, which I hope might be of some use to ascertain how far, by fitting to metrical arrangement of a selection of the real language of men in a state of vivid sensation, that sort of pleasure and that quantity of pleasure may be imparted, which a poet may rationally endeavor to impart. So a poet, when he writes poetry, he tries to impart a certain kind of pleasure and a certain quantity of pleasure. All right. So their experiment was that they wanted to fit into metrical arrangement. Metrical means in poetry you have meter. Okay, you write lines just not randomly, like in prose. You fit them into a certain structure which is called meter. So he's saying that we were going for arranging lines in a meter. And what kind of lines? Not just any special kind of things, but real language of men in state of vivid sensation. So their purpose was to do an experiment where they would be writing poetry based on real language. So that is the keynote of the preface, real language of men. And then he goes on to say that I did not want to write this preface. My friends asked me to do this. I'm not a theorist, but I'm trying to put into words what I feel about these poems. And then he goes on to say those things. The principal object, then, which I proposed to myself in these poems was to choose incidents and situations from common life and to relate or describe them throughout as far as possible in a selection of language really used by men. So the most important expressions in this line are common life and language used by men. You might find him repetitive, but he really wants to make his point across. So his objective in writing the poems that he did for Lyrical Ballads was to use incidents from common life, number one, and number two, described in everyday language. But there is something else as well. He continues to say, and at the same time, to throw over them a certain coloring of imagination. So it's not like he's going to give you a straightforward, I saw this kind of a poem. He's going to color it by his imagination. And he uses the word imagination here in a very general sense, which Coleridge does not approve of. And when we will be reading Biographia Literaria, maybe I can then dwell on the ways in which Coleridge differed from the generalized view of imagination that Wordsworth is giving to us. For Wordsworth, imagination is a very simple concept. It just means your ability to add color to whatever you're experiencing so that it becomes poetry when you express it. And further, and above all, to make these incidents and situations interesting. Now, it's like he's saying, I'm going to talk about a person in a natural setting, and I'm going to use imagination, I'm going to use the language of common man. But why am I going to do this? Because I want to trace in that common man something that exists in everyone. So he is also talking about universality of experience that is found in the world of nature or in people who live amidst nature. All right. So here you have two things working. One, although Wordsworth is not politicizing his work, but still he is bringing into focus the lives, the experiences of the common people. His heroes wouldn't be aristocrats or nobility or queens and kings, but those poor people whose lives are left unsung by the poets, usually. And the second aspect is that he's talking about going back to nature. What kind of nature? Nature that is not corrupted by civilization, by urbanization. And this idea of a human being placed in a natural context is also the root of Wordsworth's pantheism. Pantheism means there is God in everything, even in me. So it's like one spirit is connecting everything. And this is what makes him work against the idea of the isolated self. The isolated self is not actually isolated. It is actually part of bigger universe where everything is connected to everything. If you are feeling confused, think about Tintin Abbey. It's like the spirit flowing through everything, the one spirit. Now he gives justification that why did he choose people belonging to the villages, the rustic life. And he says, low and rustic life was generally chosen because in that condition, the essential passions of the heart find a better soil. So there are passions in the heart, the emotions that we have. He is saying that the emotions in our hearts, they are cultivated better in rustic people. And why is it so? Of course it is. It is very logical also. If you are in a civilized space, an urban space, not just civilized, villages are also civilized spaces. I'm talking about urban city lives. You will feel that life is very artificial there. You need to, as Prufrock says, put on faces that we put on. And we have to assume certain personalities to blend in, to communicate with people. We have to maintain these etiquettes which do not come naturally to us. And that makes us more and more distant from our real emotions. But if you go to some remote place, you'll find that people there are far less inhibiting themselves, far less conscious of how they are eating, how they are talking, how they are sitting. All right. And that makes them more natural. And that makes them more appropriate as subject of poetry for Wordsworth, because his object is to present human passions which are not corrupted by any other outside influences like civilization. So he says they find a better soil in which they can attain their maturity, are less under restraint. In rural context, people are more natural. They don't have those restraints which stops them from telling what they are feeling, and speak a plainer and more emphatic language. Because in that condition of life, our elementary feelings coexist in a state of greater simplicity. And then he says, lastly, because in that condition, the passions of men are incorporated with the beautiful and permanent forms of nature. When he uses the expression forms of nature, he is actually talking about the idea of forms that Plato had given to us, that everything that is perfect exists in the world of forms and ideas. It doesn't exist in the world you are seeing around you. But Wordsworth is saying the more you are in tune with nature, the more you are in a natural space, the more you are close to that ideal world of forms. Again, he continues later, from such verses, the poems in these volumes will be found distinguished at least by one mark of difference. So after this, he is directly talking about the usual idea of poetry that was prevalent, that I was referring to as the neoclassical perspective. And then he's saying that nowadays I see poets writing poems which I do not approve as poetry. So he is downright discarding everything that is written before him to establish the supremacy of what he is trying to achieve. And he says, my poetry is different. And how does he establish this difference? he says, for all good poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. This is one statement. For him, he would be severely criticized by people like T.S. Eliot. If we look at this one statement, there are three key words here: spontaneous, overflow, feelings. These three define Wordsworth's idea of poetry. Spontaneous means something which comes automatically, without thinking, without applying any conscious effort on your part. If you simply speak out whatever comes to your mind, that is spontaneous. Overflow. Overflow means something which is so much powerful inside you, so filled with a certain kind of an emotion that you simply burst for. And then what comes out? Feelings comes out. Feelings are reactions to what you see, what you hear, in short, what you experience with your five senses. Now we come straight to again the point of Descartes. Where do feelings reside? Feelings reside in your mind. Where does experience reside? Experience resides in your body, right? You see with your eyes, you hear with your ear. You have sensation of warmth, coldness with your skin. So this is all your body. So whatever you are experiencing is done through your body, but whatever you feel, it cannot be placed anywhere in your body, because those are emotions, abstract things, ideas, and you can't even pinpoint them in some neurological center in your brain, because they don't exist in any particular cell or tissue. They are connections that are giving rise to those feelings. Therefore, feelings are the thing that joins mind and body. And this is how the Romantics are kind of working on the ideas of Descartes, not completely refuting him, but working on him to make progress from there. So for Wordsworth, good poetry is, if you simplify this statement, it's like an automatic outpouring of powerful feelings. You can't simplify that. And then he says that all good poetry is this. So first he says that whatever poetry is written as good poetry defined by the neoclassicist thinkers, they are not good poetry. And then he says all good poetry is spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. Now my point is he saying Milton's Paradise Lost is a piece of good poetry or bad poetry? He's not giving that example here because he knows that if he says Milton writes bad poetry, nobody would validate his statements anymore. But according to this definition, whatever poetry is written before him where things were not spontaneous, where there were revisions and poets thought about technique when they were writing, that is all discarded as bad poetry. Now, if you remember Paradise Lost, you would also remember that Milton is claiming there in the very invocation that it is not written by him, it is dictated to him by some heavenly muse. So is that spontaneous? Again, he also said that I will be trying to do things unattempted yet in prose or rhyme. So going against conventions. What Wordsworth is saying is that you have to be spontaneous. And this is something that we find in a very simple sonnet that we usually have in our undergrad classes. It is by Sir Philip Sidney, where he says, look into thy heart and write. The muse, the inspiring figure, told him that why are you looking here and there, making a big deal about crafting things? You simply look into your heart and write. The same idea is brought in here by Wordsworth. So it is not that Wordsworth is saying something very unique. People have said that earlier, but he is only theorizing it for us. that it has to be spontaneous overflow, unrestricted by codes and conventions of what a poem should look like. Then you should sit and write that. Don't do that. Whatever comes to your mind, you write that down. And there is also an added thing that he says, which many people miss, and that is why they accuse him that spontaneity is not a poetry. A person should think about it. He does say that, yes, you should think about it. And people ignore that statement, which comes immediately after. He says, poems to which any value can be attached, that means any kind of good poem, were never produced on any variety of subjects but by a man, is trying to say that good poetry were produced by a poet who is possessed of more than usual organic sensibility, had also thought long and deeply. So not just sensibility, but also the idea of thinking. So people who accuse Wordsworth that he is saying that poetry is spontaneous and that means it has no thought in it, he never says that. He actually says that yes, you get inspired, you be spontaneous, and then you think about that spontaneity, you think about that idea, that experience, and then you write. I'll refer to daffodils here. In the poem Daffodils, what is he doing? He's talking about beautiful field of daffodils and they are playing and dancing and so that. But that is not just what the poem is about. Come to the last stanza. For often in my couch I lie in vacant or in pensive moan. And then in his inward eye, the soul, the imagination, that scene flashes. So he did not write on the daffodils the moment he was looking at the daffodils. He wrote about the daffodils when the image was giving him some kind of restoration, some kind of power to fight reality, a kind of elevated joy, filled his mind with joy. Sitting on his couch, thinking about that. So it is not the spontaneous overflow on a field of daffodils. It was a thought on the spontaneous feelings that he was having when he was looking at the daffodils. So it's like a chain reaction happening here. So you see, you will always have to connect to his poetry to understand what he's trying to say here. After this, he states the purpose of the poems, where he shows how feelings and ideas are joined and associated when you're having an intense moment. What are feelings? Related to how you react to anything that you experience through your five senses. Those are feelings. What are ideas? Ideas belong to the world of the mind. So feelings and ideas are basically connected. How? When you are very intense. When you eat something nice, you're tasting with your tongue, smelling with your nose. You feel satisfied, right? That is feelings. But suppose that is something that your mother used to cook and she is now no more. Then it won't be just feelings. You would be nostalgic for your past and you will have so many emotions in you. Emotions because of that one dish that is served to you, tasting like your mother's cooking. Why is this possible? Because you have intensity of emotion. All right, now you understand feeling and emotion. Nostalgia is an emotion. Feeling good about a food is feeling. All right, it is connected when there is some association. There is some emotional connection. This is what Wordsworth is talking about. Let's see what he says. One other circumstance which distinguishes these poems from the popular poetry of the day, how his poems are different, is that the feeling therein developed gives importance to the action and situation. In the contemporary poems, in the poems written by people all around Wordsworth, the importance is to action and situation, not on the feeling. They are focusing on what a person is doing. But Wordsworth is saying that my poetry focuses on, yes, action and situation is there, but that is the subsidiary thing. The main focus is what feelings are generated. by that. So the subject of the poem Daffodils is not the daffodils, but the feelings which are generated when he looks at the scene in his mind. Again, in Tintin Abbey, the Tintin Abbey, the natural landscape, those things are not the focus. The focus is how he's feeling about his personal change, the way he used to act earlier and the way he's acting now, and how is that going to have an impact in his sister's life when she grows up. She was grown up, but when she grows older. And then, if you look at the names of his poems, which he mentions here, Poor Susan, Childless Father, and such poems give us this idea that he is talking about individuals in a natural setting, but individuals who are not given any kind of priority normally in life, who are alienated from society, outcasts. Sometimes they are not acknowledged as persons of any importance at all. And he says, the subject is indeed important, for the human mind is capable of being excited without the application of gross and violent stimulants. So first he says that my focus is individual who is away from this complicated urban world. And then the next thing that he talks about is that the subject of his poem, the topic on which he is writing, is also important, but that doesn't mean that topic is going to be something very sensational. You know what sensational is? Look at the news channels. They give you sensational news. And why they do that? Because they have to compete against each other to keep us excited. We go to those channels where people shout the most, and we still curse them for shouting, and then we still go there. I don't know how Wordsworth, he was very prophetic, I believe. Back in 1800, he is saying that our minds would be numbed by this noise. And he's actually writing that. For a multitude of causes unknown to former times are now acting with a combined force to blunt the discriminating powers of the mind. We don't have anymore any idea of what is good, what is bad, what is justice, what is punishment, what is criminal, who is a criminal. This discrimination, what is humanity, what is not. This discrimination is going away and unfitting it for all voluntary exertion to reduce it to a state of almost savage torpor. Torpor is you are in a state where you can't move, like Eliot's patient etherized upon a table. You can experience, but you can't participate. That is torpor. Nowhere, standing, stagnant. How do we look like when we are watching TV? Have you ever thought about that? If you're not, just try to think about it. What our expressions look like when we look at those sensational news flashing. That kind of a vague expression is torpor. It's like our sensibilities are numbed. We are no more shocked by violence. We are not moved by devastations, destructions. And we need more and more and more of it every day. And he says, the most effective of these causes are the great national events which are daily taking place and the increasing accumulation of men in cities. So number one, he was writing 10 years after the French Revolution. So yes, national news was an important thing there. A lot of things were happening in the political way, you can say, and people were getting more and more engaged. And because it was right after the time of the periodical essays and newspapers were also very much in vogue back then, people's minds were always engaged in seeking one sensational news after another, which kind of numbed their sensibilities. And the second thing is that increasing accumulation of men in cities, the mass exodus towards urban centers, the industrialization. And Wordsworth has always reacted against it. The pollution of the cities. Even when he writes about a cityscape upon Westminster Bridge, he is talking about a cityscape just before the factories start pouring out those menacing smoke. The beauty is still attainable, but at a moment when activities of civilization are suspended for some little time, the dawn, the daybreak. And then he says, what is happening to literature? What is happening to theatre? People are getting desensitized. What about art? What about literature? And he says, to this tendency of life and manners, the literature and theatrical exhibitions of the country have conformed themselves. Same thing is happening in literature, same thing is happening in theatre. The invaluable works of our elder writers, I had almost said the works of Shakespeare and Milton, are driven into neglect. And he is really criticizing frantic novels, sickly and stupid German tragedies, and delusions of idle and extravagant stories in verse. So he is frustrated by this absolute absence of originality and regrets the idea that nowadays nobody reads Shakespeare and Milton anymore. And then he thinks that I have written a bunch of poems and I'm trying to say that I am writing differently, but I think it's a very feeble effort. It is not a very strong effort. So he is apologetic that it's a huge evil that he is fighting against. And he just has a handful of poems, but then it is all that he can do at the moment. And then he is going to the technical aspect of poetry. So first, he establishes some context against which he will be talking about why he is writing the poems the way he is writing them. So after having dealt with the subject and aim of the poems, talk about the style of the poems. So this is the next. So you can imagine him talking episodically. So this is the episode on style. He rejects at the very onset the use of personification. He does not like to use personification. He says so, but I don't know. I feel his poems are filled with personifications. I think he has some different idea about personification than I have, because I really feel that the daffodils, they actually dance like human beings, and the River Wye in Tinton Abbey, it's like a woman flowing down. He thinks he's not using personification, but yes, he says so. Personifications of abstract ideas rarely occur in these volumes and are utterly rejected. I have proposed to myself to imitate and, as far as is possible, to adopt the very language of men. And assuredly, such personifications do not make any natural or regular part of that language. Now, I think what he is actually referring to personification is the kind of things we see in metaphysical conceits. Okay, something which appear very disparate, something not really connectable, something which we don't say in normal everyday language, right? So maybe he is referring to some extraordinary kind of personifications that we come across in metaphysical poetry, even in neoclassical poetry. And he says that I don't want any artificiality in my poems. Whatever we do in our real everyday language, we will do in our poems. He says, I have made use of them as such, but I have endeavored utterly to reject them as a mechanical device of style. So I have used personification when it comes naturally. Fine. Okay. And then he says, what is the other thing that he has rejected? So number one, that thing that he has rejected is artificial use of personification. And the second thing is poetic diction. Now, what is diction? In loose terms, very loose terms, diction means the way in which you arrange your words, your style in general, or the way in which you craft your sentences. For instance, if you are supposed to write an essay for your assessment or home assignment, sometimes what you do, you just jot down the points that come to your mind, and then you work on the paragraphs, and then you watch a few videos or read a little, add a quote, right? And then you look at the sentences. Maybe sometimes you feel that, okay, I've used a lot of active voice. Let me change this into passive voice because it's a formal thing I'm presenting. So it should look formal, and passive voice is a more proper thing for academic writing. So these are the ways in which you revise your work. So that revision is changing your diction. Okay, the way in which you are presenting yourself. Every poetry has a diction. What he is saying is that diction is a deliberate activity on the part of the poet. All right. He says that if I write something and I go on revising it, then I lose what I originally felt and wrote. All right. I don't know why he revised his preface again for like 1802 edition. He revised his preludes, and we are not sure of how many revisions other poems had. But he is definitely talking about poetic diction as something which does not exist in his poems. Now, if poetic diction does not exist in his poems, what was he revising? When you revise diction. So it's like you are revising the vocabulary, you are choosing a different word, all right, replacing that word. So if he is so against poetic diction, how can he justify his own acts of revisions? Sometimes great people contradict themselves. I have taken as much pains to avoid it as others ordinarily take to produce it. This I have done for the reason already alleged, to bring my language near to the language of men. Now, why is he constantly prioritizing this idea of the language of man? If a neoclassical poet is writing in an artificial language, then that is also a language of a man. Man as in generic man. I'm not making a difference here between man and woman. The point is, artificial language is also language. Natural language is also language. I mean, language itself is such an artificial thing. It is not a natural thing. Language itself is anti-nature. Because if you say someone that you love that person, does the word love contain the entire emotion? No. So it is working against nature. Language is a system of sign, symbol, codification, restriction. So how can he say that he can be more natural if he is using the language of men? Because there also he is bound by the restrictions of language. This is one criticism you can have for this preface. Then he is saying, another point which I notice here, is that he wants to bring his language near to the language of men. So he, from the beginning, although we call him a very democratic poet, he is constantly alluding to the language of men belonging to the world of nature as different from the language used by him. And he's talking about making an effort to bring his language near the language of men. So if he's saying that his poetry involves a kind of effort, then how can he say his poetry is spontaneous? You can't be both making an effort to talk like somebody and be spontaneous at the same time. So see, he is going on contradicting himself. I love Wordsworth, but this is true. He is contradicting himself. And then he says, if in a poem there should be found a series of lines or even a single line in which the language, though naturally arranged and according to the strict laws of meter, now I don't understand this expression naturally arranged. Language is never naturally arranged. Language is artificial. When dogs bark, that is naturally arranged. Okay. The point is, what he means is, it is less restricted. The language that he is talking about is less restricted because it belongs to the people who belong to the world of nature or the villagers. And then he says, if any such line is found in a poem, although poem is ruled by the strict laws of meter, if any such line is found which does not differ from that of prose, there is a numerous class of critics who, when they stumble upon these prosaisms, as they call them, imagine that they have made a notable discovery, and they say that this poet is a bad poet. He says that if there is any line in a poem which looks like prose, then people reject it as poems, or they say that the poet is not good. Now, this approach or this kind of point of view is very similar to what T.S. Eliot was having too, because if you look at the use of expressions in poems like Prufrock and then Preludes, The Wasteland, look at the number of lines which look like prose, right? And the entire movement of modernism, modern poetry, that was a movement towards freeing yourself from the constraints and conventions of verse. So what Wordsworth is doing here, he is saying that the opposite of poetry is not prose. Because in poetry, you can have lines which look like prose. This is a very, very confusing statement, because the opposite of prose is verse. And the word verse, when we think about it, we think about rhyme. But now, when we already have read poems by so many practitioners of blank verse and free verse, we know that rhyme doesn't matter. But meter matters. You have to be able to recite a poem. You have to have stress, unstress, that kind of a pattern. Sometimes those are loose patterns. Sometimes they are rigidly employed. But still, there is some movement. But when we speak to a person, we don't speak in patterns. This is what he's saying, that prose means lines in a poem where it is just spoken like a normal conversation, like a man speaking to men. He will come to that. He's saying that nowadays critics say that this poet has put in a line which looks like prose. That means this poet is inefficient, incompetent. But he says that no, and he makes a very strong statement here. He says, some of the most interesting parts of the best poems will be found to be strictly the language of prose when prose is well written. First, this person is talking about real language, then he's talking about, from the beginning, he is making a distinction between oral language and written language, and he prioritizes oral language. But here again he says, no, not oral language written. So it becomes written language. So here things get more and more confusing. So to give you some clarity, think of it in this way, that when you have a very interesting line in a poem, very remarkable line in a poem, that line is interesting or remarkable not because it is forming a rhyming pattern, not because it is a nice way in which you can read it. It has nothing to do with the meter. It has nothing to do with the rhyme, but it is to do with the content of that line, right? Because that is how we speak. When we speak, we don't speak in rhymes. We speak our content. And so the best part of any poem is the part which prioritizes content over form. This is Wordsworth's idea. And then he also gives some examples from Gray to establish how language of prose may be a part of poetry. Usually, we think that poetry and painting, they belong to the same world, right? If there is a painting, anybody can look at it and have some conclusions. But if a critic looks at it, they will understand different kinds of meanings and layers. Similarly, if a poem is there, a layman would read it and would have some understanding, but a critic would look at it and have some bigger understanding, greater enlightenment. So we think that painting and poetry, they are similar things. They are sisters. But Wordsworth says that no, poetry and painting might have some connections, but poetry is more connected to prose than with painting. Why? Because poetry is using what? Words. When you read poems and when you talk with somebody, you're using the same organs of speech. That person is using the same auditory organs, hearing. And then he says that if poetry is so similar to prose, then why do we always say that poetry talks about things which prose cannot talk about? And he uses a line from Milton here and says, Milton had used this expression such as angels weep in context of Satan when he was trying to convince the rebel angels. If you have watched my videos, you would remember about their future course of action, and he was trying to show how serious he is, how affected he is, and he tries to shed a few tears. And Milton says that his tears are the ones such as angels weep, which is again focusing on the fact that he's not an angel, a good angel. All right. So he says here, poetry sheds no tears such as angels weep. So things in poetry do not belong to the world of angels. It is something that belongs to the world of common man, but natural and human tears. And so, if poetry is about natural human condition, who is a poet? That is the next thing that he speaks about in this preface. Who is a poet? To whom does he address himself? And what language is to be expected from him? And then he answers, he is a man speaking to men. Again, please take it in a generic way. Man as in human. So, poet is a human being speaking to another human being. You would feel that what is so special about this? The word speaking is very special. What is the difference between speech and writing? Speech is spontaneous. Writing is calculated. Speech is natural. Okay, language is not that natural, but speech involves using things that nature has given you. You just need your mouth to speak and your tongue, your teeth, things which nature has given you. What do you need for writing? You need a medium on which you will write. You need a pen, a pencil, a chalk, something. So obviously, it is not a natural process, writing. If it was a natural process, animals would write. Animals do speak. We don't understand their language, but they have their own way of voicing out whatever they are feeling. So speech is more connected to natural feelings than writing is. So he's saying he's a man speaking to men. It means a poet is more connected to his own natural feelings, his own instincts, and he's more spontaneous because he's speaking. He is not writing to man. In fact, if you think about it, the greatest thinkers, according to European tradition of intellect, had never been writers. Socrates never wrote a thing. Jesus Christ never wrote a thing. Gautam Buddha did not write anything. Lord Krishna, he did not write the Bhagavad Gita. He spoke it out. So speech is spontaneous, more inspired. Speech is where you connect to that higher power. And he's saying, poet is a man speaking to men. So that is again making this poet divinely inspired in some way. Although Wordsworth is not a follower of institutionalized religion in any way, but he is definitely a believer in some kind of a spiritual force. And what kind of a man? More true than others. He has a lively sensibility, more enthusiasm, more tenderness, who has a greater knowledge of human nature, more comprehensive soul, understands everything more than are supposed to be common among mankind. A man pleased with his own passions and volitions, somebody who is not very disturbed all the time. If you are very disturbed all the time, you cannot write. Now, this is his version. Poets of angry young generation would think otherwise. They would feel that, yes, I need excitement and I also need disturbance. Eliot, He was on the verge of a complete mental breakdown when he was writing. Sylvia Plath, look at so many disturbed souls who were such great poets, but Wordsworth is saying that no, he has to be happy, content, like he has attained some kind of an intellectual nirvana. And what other qualities should a poet possess? To these qualities, he has added a disposition to be affected more than other men by absent things. You also have to have the power of imagining things which are not there and then being affected by it. So he is again talking about imagination here, as if they were present. An ability of conjuring up in himself passions which are indeed far from being the same as those produced by real events. So exactly like the ones which happens, like you have imagination and then you have calmness in you and you create for yourself a kind of a situation where you are imagining things, and that makes you a poet. He has acquired a greater readiness and power in expressing what he thinks and feels, and especially those thoughts and feelings which by his own choice or from the structure of his own mind arise in him without immediate external excitement. It means that if you are a poet, since you have the imagination power or the power of imagination, you can sit in a couch doing nothing, making yourself imagine the daffodils, get excited about them, and then create poetry. So he is saying that poetry or writing of poetry involves a certain kind of a deliberate action on your part. You are to imagine things. So again, is he actually talking about spontaneity here? You will see that he is talking about two things here. By his own choice, this means not spontaneous. He is deciding that now I want to feel nostalgic, so I will think about the daffodils or the Tintin Abbey. And then the second part of this sentence is, or from the structure of his own mind. This is spontaneous. Your brain is so connected, like the neurons. They are giving rise to this spontaneous imagination. So what is it? Imagination as a spontaneous thing or imagination as a conscious effort? He does not make a difference here. He says that this way or that, you end up feeling excited by things which are not present in front of you if you are a good poet. All right. So good poet is what? A man speaking to men, higher sensitivity, higher sensibility, higher knowledge, state of some kind of an intellectual, spiritual calmness, ability to conjure up images through imagination and create situations which will excite certain kind of feelings. That is the profile of a poet. He is imagining a situation and then he is writing on paper what that situation implies. That means he is actually translating something from the world of nature to the page on which he is writing. And Wordsworth actually calls him a translator who deems himself justified when he substitutes excellences of another kind for those which are unattainable by him and endeavors occasionally to surpass his original. Sometimes he makes an effort so that whatever he is representing, he is doing it better than the original. Now it comes to Aristotle. Aristotle, I have been told, had said poetry is the most philosophic of all writing. It is so. He is not denying that. He is saying that yes, poetry is a very philosophical thing. Its object is truth, not individual and local, but general and operative. I'm writing about the fisherman, but I'm not writing about the fisherman. I'm talking about the universal aspects in the fisherman. So this is his logic. And then the argument goes on to the way in which the use of meter is justified in poetry. He was saying in the beginning that prose is superior, or it is closer to the real language of men. Then, do we feel that he's saying meter is not good for expressing truth? Is he rejecting meter? He's not rejecting meter. He makes a very interesting observation, coming down to the part where he says, our feelings are the same with respect to meter, for as it may be proper to remind the reader, so he's reminding us The distinction of meter is regular and uniform, and not like that which is produced by what is usually called poetic diction, arbitrary, subject to infinite caprices. So he makes a distinguishing thing here. He says that poetic diction and meter is not same. Poetic diction is more like use of stylized words, synonyms which sound more pleasant to the ear, use of bombastic words at times. That is diction. But meter is the way in which you arrange the line to be following a certain pattern of stress and unstress, so that when you recite the poem, it gives a kind of a regular break. All right, gives it a poetic sound. So he says that meter and diction are different things, and people might ask me, why have I written in verse? Yes, we have this question. Then he says, the great and universal passions of men, the most general and interesting of their occupations, and the entire world of nature, from which I am at liberty to supply myself with endless combinations of forms and imagery. So I think my job is to bring to my readers all these things. All these things. These are my potential objects of poetry. And that means I'm going to feel a lot of things, have great intensity of emotions. Meter will help me refine my emotions, put them in check, so that they are kept presentable. And he writes like this: a very small part of the pleasure given by poetry depends upon meter. He says that meter is not something that makes the most important aspect of poetry. Meter is more like an ornament. The end of poetry, the purpose of poetry, is to produce excitement in coexistence with an overbalance of pleasure. So pleasure, excitement, these are the things that a poetry intends you to have. Now, he's saying, excitement is an unusual and irregular state of mind. Normally, we are not excited. We are sitting back, looking blankly at things. And then excitement comes in bursts, right? He's saying this. Excitement is unusual and irregular. Ideas and feelings do not, in that state, succeed each other in accustomed order. And when we are excited, sometimes we lose our functioning of logic. It happens, see, when you're overly angry, overly depressed, you say all wrong things which logically don't apply. And later on, when you come to a calm state, you think about that thing and then you think, what am I thinking? So, yes, he's right. If you are excited, then you often lose focus of logical analysis. But if the words by which this excitement is produced are in themselves powerful, but if you are having very powerful things here going on with you, there is some danger that the excitement may be carried beyond its proper bounds. You might be so angry that you just do what Sylvia Plath does in the last line of Daddy. This is what Wordsworth is saying. I'm not saying. I totally approve Sylvia Plath's writing. I love that. But this is what Wordsworth would have said had he read Sylvia Plath's poem, the last line at least, where she calls her father bastard, that this is what's going to happen if you don't have meter in your poem. He says, the co-presence of something regular, something to which the mind has been accustomed in various moods and in a less excited state. So this is meter. You're excited, you want to write something, and then you think that I have to stick to meter. Suddenly, you will have to, put in an effort to somehow channelize that anger or happiness or whatever excitement is there in you, to put it into some order. So meter is like a regulatory force for you. Okay, so it's like a template in which you're working. So imagine what happens when you work with any kind of a template. You can't go beyond that. So if you are very creative also, then also you have to stick to a template. That is meter. So that is useful according to Wordsworth. I have said that poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. He knows that this is going to haunt him. And he says, it takes its origin from emotion recollected in tranquility. It's not that it is the only thing that is making the poem. Okay. So he's saying that my point is poetry originates in some spontaneous feeling. And then it has to be recollected in tranquility. So he's not talking about blindly writing down whatever comes to the mind, but to think about it. So the more he's writing, the more he's appearing to be quite neoclassical in his expressions, because he is talking about the prioritization of thought as a refining thing that sorts your emotions. The other important aspect which he deals with in his preface is that what is the pleasure like which one derives from reading poetry? He's talking along the lines in which Aristotle was talking when he was speaking about catharsis, right? The pleasure of tragedy. He's saying that the problem with his contemporaries is that they want a certain kind of poems because they are so used to it. And now he's offering them a different kind of a poem. And so he says that it is possible that poetry may give other enjoyments. You have to give me a chance here. Give me a way to show that you can be entertained differently, of a purer, more lasting and more exquisite nature. And eventually he says, the interest excited by some other kinds of poetry is less vivid and less worthy of the nobler powers of mind than to offer reasons for presuming that if the object which I have proposed to myself were adequately attained, a species of poetry would be produced which is genuine poetry. He's not saying that he has given us genuine poetry. He's saying that whatever I am proposing as the object of poetry, the quality of poetry, the quality of poet, if they're followed, then some genuine things can come to intellectual space. So this is like an invitation to futurity, a hopeful conclusion that we are starting something and I want people to carry this on. In its nature, well adapted to interest mankind permanently, and likewise important in the multiplicity and quality of its moral relations. So yes, he does use the word moral here because although he is so desperately trying to break free from the conventions, somehow he has always been very, very conscious of how his poetry is going to communicate some kind of a moral message. And he actually invites us to read his poems and to decide whether he has managed to stick to these principles when he was writing, and then he ends his disclaimer. And we also have a note from Wordsworth where he talks about the word poetry, saying that it is opposed to the word prose. He says that I here use the word poetry as opposed to the word prose. Now, why is he doing this? Because earlier he had made us quite confused, saying that the best of poetry is a line written in prose. And then we started to think that if poetry is what is not prose, then how can you have prose in poetry? So he is saying that, yes, you might be confused that poetry is used as something opposed to prose, but what I actually want to say is that poetry is not opposed to prose, meter is opposed to prose. Prose is something which we speak in, meter is something which we write in, so they are opposed. So he tries to give some clarification, which doesn't make things very clear for us also, because there are some basic contradictions which I have pointed out already to you. So what do we gather from this essay? What are the main points of this essay, if you can list them down? The first is nature of poetry. He says that poetry arises from spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, reflecting deep emotional experiences. Second thing is emotional reflection. Poetry is born from emotions recollected in tranquility. All right. So importance on emotions and importance on recollection, thought. And then third point is importance of language. Poet should use the language that closely resembles real speech. And then fourth important point is metrical composition or meter, where he says that metrical language provides pleasure through a balance of excitement and restraint. So meter provides the restraint, which makes poetry a pleasurable experience. He also makes a critique of different poetic styles and talks about the potential of new enjoyment, that there are so different varieties of poetry on the plate now. So he establishes that, who said that pleasure of poetry is only of one kind. It can be different kinds. Eventually, he is talking about the aim of poems, that its ultimate goal is to produce something which is authentic, so that the readers are encouraged to assess the value of poetry presented in the lyrical ballads and try to see if they at all connect to fundamental human emotions and truths or not. His preface is definitely a drastic shift from the conventions those were going on during the Neoclassical period. He is representing a democratic stand here, talking about the common people, using of common language of common man. And this is definitely, you can say, a kind of a legacy from the French Revolution, where the seeds of democracy were first sown in the land of Europe. It is not that it's a guidebook for the romantic poets like Shelley or Keats, but somehow many ideas which we find in the preface were definitely taken up by the later romantics as well. So we can say that the preface has some influence, but the most significant impact of the preface was in Wordsworth's own life, in which this presentation of these ideas led to kind of an estrangement from such a close friend he had. Maybe we can understand the reason why Coleridge was so distressed with the way in which Wordsworth was writing about imagination and meter. We will understand them if we are to have a session on Coleridge as well. If you want that, do write that down in the comment section so that I can come back with Biographia Literaria, most important topics and chapters, especially the concept of imagination and the concept of meter. So till then, thank you for the overwhelming requests for this video. I hope I have made you understand the main points of Wordsworth, and I really hope you subscribe to our channel. This is Monami Mukherjee signing off. Bye-bye.